Avery Mitchell walked into the courtroom, determined to fight for justice, only to be humiliated by the very judge who once mentored her. Thrust into an unexpected confrontation, she stood tall behind the plaintiff's table, her notes steady, her voice unwavering as she represented a young black mother in a civil suit. But instead of seeing the case before him, Judge Whitmore saw only Avery, with a faint curl of his lip. He dismissed her argument with a sneer, implying it was nothing more than an emotional crusade, not a legal one. His words landed like a slap, but it was the cold disdain in his voice, the way he belittled her presence in his courtroom, that left a lasting sting. Avery didn't flinch. She stayed calm, composed, her voice steady, refusing to be pulled into his venomous rhetoric. Her client, a woman already humiliated, looked down in shame, but Avery refused to give in. She calmly placed her papers back into her briefcase, nodded once, and quietly said, "No further comments, Your Honor." As she turned to leave, she locked eyes with the judge for just a fleeting moment. It was a look that spoke volumes, no anger, no tears, just a quiet determination, like the calm before a storm. Avery walked out of the courtroom in silence. But she wasn't done. The sting of his words haunted her long after she left. That night, alone at her kitchen table, she relived the moment, wondering if the man she once admired was truly the same. But as she sat there, she realized that this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And Avery knew the truth had to come to light, no matter how painful it might be. Avery Mitchell had once looked up to Judge Whitmore, admiring his wisdom and the guidance he offered during her law school years. She remembered the summer after her second year, when she was chosen for a mentoring program for minority students. Judge Whitmore had been her first mentor, and his presence was magnetic. He saw something in her, something that no one else had noticed, and for a moment, she believed that he truly understood her struggle. He had told her, "You don't ask for a seat. You sharpen your voice until they can't ignore you." Those words stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she faced the challenges of being a young black woman in a profession that wasn't built for her. She held onto those words as a guiding light, using them to power through the dismissive attitudes and biases she encountered. But that night, as she sat in her kitchen staring at the cold surface of her tea, she realized that the man she once admired may have never truly seen her at all. The smirk, the cold dismissal in the courtroom, it made her question everything. Was he just using her, convenient for his legacy, while silently judging her for what she represented? She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the betrayal. Her thoughts turned to her mother, who had worked tirelessly to get her to this point. Avery had promised her mother that she would never waste the sacrifices she made. And yet here she was, feeling small and insignificant under the weight of this man's contempt. But as the darkness of the evening settled around her, Avery made a decision. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, about ensuring the truth was seen, no matter the cost. She knew she had to push forward, to expose what lay beneath the surface, even if it meant walking into a battle she hadn't anticipated. In the courtroom, Avery Mitchell was met with disdain that cut deeper than any legal argument. As she stood, resolute in her defense of a young black mother, she faced not just the case at hand, but the harshness of Judge Whitmore's words. His contempt was palpable as he sneered at her, reducing her well-prepared case to nothing more than an emotional crusade. The sting of his words was sharp, but it was the venom in his tone, the cold dismissal of her presence, that rattled her the most. In that moment, Avery felt the weight of every unjust glance, every silencing comment she'd endured in her career. Yet, despite the crushing blow, she didn't rise to the provocation. She didn't shout, didn't argue. Instead, Avery kept her composure, her calm unwavering in the face of his cruel mockery. She simply gathered her papers, placed them neatly into her briefcase, and with a quiet nod, said, "No further comments, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent, but Avery's silence spoke louder than any words could. As she turned to leave, her eyes met his for just a brief moment, a look that held more power than any verbal confrontation. There was no anger, no tears, only the quiet stillness of someone who knew that this battle was far from over. Outside the courtroom, Avery didn't feel defeated, she felt a fire burning inside her. A fierce determination that this injustice wouldn't go unnoticed. She was not just fighting for her client, she was fighting for every voice that had been silenced. Every person dismissed by those in power. This wasn't about revenge, this was about truth, about breaking the silence that had been forced upon her, and making sure that the truth would be heard, no matter what. Avery Mitchell knew that this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about ensuring that the injustice she faced was exposed and not buried under layers of power and silence. As she sat in her apartment that night, the sting of Judge Whitmore's cruel words still lingered. But it wasn't anger that filled her heart. It was something deeper, something more unshakable, a quiet resolve. She thought of her mother, the woman who had sacrificed so much for her to get to this point. Her mother, who had worked tirelessly, her hands worn and her spirit never breaking. Also Avery could chase her dreams. Avery had promised her mother that she would never waste the sacrifices made for her success. And now, as the weight of Whitmore's insults pressed down on her, Avery realized that the fight she was about to take on wasn't just for herself, it was for the women like Aaron Taylor. For the voices that had been muted by a system that refused to see them. The next morning, the call came, a new door opened, and Avery stepped through it, not with a sense of vengeance but with the weight of responsibility. Judge Bradford's offer to become special counsel for judicial ethics was the turning point she hadn't expected. But the moment she knew she couldn't turn away from. It was a rare opportunity to make a difference, to uncover the truth that had been carefully hidden by those who had the power to control it. Avery wasn't just about to challenge one man, she was about to challenge a system that had allowed men like Whitmore to thrive unchecked. With a quiet but determined heart, she accepted. This wasn't personal, it was a call for justice. She had no idea how far it would take her. But Avery knew one thing for certain, the truth had to come out. No matter the cost. Avery Mitchell's decision to take on the role of special counsel for judicial ethics wasn't just a career move, it was a commitment to expose the truth. No matter the personal cost. The weight of the task ahead settled heavily on her shoulders. But it didn't deter her. She thought of the countless voices that had been silenced, the injustices ignored, and the people like Aaron Taylor who had been denied a fair chance simply because of who they were. Avery had never shied away from a challenge. But this one felt different. She wasn't just taking on a corrupt judge, she was confronting an entire system that had allowed corruption to thrive unchecked. The morning the call came, Avery was already at the crossroads. She knew that accepting would mean walking into a battle alone, without the safety net of a law firm behind her or the shield of neutrality to protect her. It would mean investigating someone with immense power, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. But then she remembered her mother's unwavering sacrifices, how she had worked tirelessly to give Avery the life she now had. How she had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders just to see her daughter succeed. Avery couldn't ignore the truth. Not when she had the power to bring it to light. Judge Whitmore's actions weren't just an isolated incident, they were part of a much larger pattern of bias, discrimination, and cruelty. By accepting the position, Avery knew she was taking the first step toward exposing those hidden truths. No matter how dangerous or daunting it might be, it wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. And for Avery, that was worth any sacrifice. With a steady hand, she reached for the file, knowing that the journey ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But she was ready. The truth had found its champion, and Avery would see it through to the end. As Avery Mitchell delved deeper into the investigation, she uncovered a chilling truth that shook her to the core. The evidence against Judge Whitmore wasn't just circumstantial, it was overwhelming. Undeniable. With every file she flipped through, every complaint she read, the pattern became clearer. Judge Whitmore hadn't simply been a judge with a bias, he had used his power to manipulate and destroy lives. His decisions, though often buried under legal jargon and procedural technicalities, were rooted in prejudice and disdain for the people he deemed unworthy. Avery's heart grew heavy with each new revelation. She had believed, perhaps naively, that the justice system was meant to serve all, that it could be trusted to do what was right. But with every case she reviewed, she saw the cracks in that illusion. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged, designed to favor those with power, to silence the voices of those who needed it most. The case of Aaron Taylor hit her hardest. Avery could feel the pain of this mother, torn away from her child because of a system that deemed her not compliant enough. Her voice not quiet enough to satisfy the court. The words from Whitmore's ruling haunted her. This court needs compliant mothers, not mouthy ones. They weren't just words. They were a symbol of everything wrong with a system that allowed this kind of cruelty to go unchecked. Avery sat late into the night, poring over case files, transcripts, and complaints. It wasn't just about the individual wrongs anymore. It was about something larger, something structural. And with each piece of evidence, her resolve grew stronger. She would expose this truth. She would make sure it couldn't be ignored any longer. There was no turning back now. Not when she knew the truth had to be heard. The weight of it all was immense. But Avery understood now that the truth wasn't just a burden, it was her responsibility. And she would carry it until it was seen. Until the system could no longer protect those like Judge Whitmore. Avery Mitchell sat at the long conference table, her binder open in front of her. As the room buzzed with tension, Judge Whitmore sat across from her, flanked by his high-powered attorney and two other judges who had long backed him. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as her moment arrived to present the truth she had spent countless nights uncovering. With a quiet breath, Avery began, not with a grand gesture or a fiery speech, but with simple clarity. She spoke of the emails, the transcripts, the patterns she had pieced together, each exhibit a nail in the coffin of Whitmore's carefully constructed facade. The first exhibit she presented was an email dated October 3, with a subject line that read, "Case Priority," in which Whitmore referred to a plaintiff as loud and ideological, a reference to Aaron Taylor. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Avery continued, her voice steady, each piece of evidence meticulously laid out, not to attack but to reveal the truth. With the second exhibit, the room grew quieter as she read from a custody case transcript, Whitmore's words. "This court needs compliant mothers, not mouthy ones," echoed in the room, sending a ripple of discomfort through the judges present. Avery's voice never wavered, her delivery calm yet unyielding. She cited the Judicial Conduct Code, clearly stating how Whitmore's actions violated every principle of fairness, equality, and justice. As she spoke, the room shifted. The quiet that followed wasn't one of awkwardness but reverence. For the first time, Avery could see that her pursuit of justice wasn't just a battle against one man, it was a battle against the very system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. She had given him the truth, raw and undeniable. There was no need for a dramatic outburst, no need to shout. The silence in the room spoke louder than any words could. Avery had done what she came to do. She had laid the truth bare. And now it was up to them to see it. Avery Mitchell walked into the room with a calm resolve that belied the storm swirling inside her. The tension in the air was palpable as the full assembly of the district judiciary gathered. A rare occasion filled with whispered conversations and sidelong glances. She stood at the door for a brief moment, letting the room settle around her. Before stepping forward, the murmurs died down as heads turned in her direction. Among them was Judge Whitmore, whose eyes flickered with recognition, disbelief, and something colder, unease. It was a look of a man confronted with a past he thought he had buried. Avery didn't flinch. She didn't react to his unease or the weight of the history between them. Her presence spoke louder than any words could. She was no longer the young attorney he had dismissed so easily in his courtroom. Now, she was someone with the power to make him face the consequences of his actions. As she walked to the center of the room, Chief Judge Bradford introduced her with quiet dignity. "Miss Avery Mitchell will serve as our new special counsel on judicial ethics and oversight," she said, her words carrying a weight that resonated in the room. Avery nodded politely. her gaze sweeping across the faces of the judges. Some warm, some tight. She didn't need to make a grand statement. The truth had already been set into motion. And it was undeniable. As she spoke, her voice steady and measured, Avery made it clear. Justice must begin at the bench. Because if the foundation is cracked, the verdict never stands. There was no anger, no vengeance in her words, just the unwavering clarity of someone who had been wronged and had chosen to fight not with fury, but with truth. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent. Avery knew, without a doubt, that the power of truth had already begun to shift the room. Avery Mitchell's victory wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet. And in its silence, it was profoundly powerful. When the decision came in a plain envelope, it wasn't delivered with fanfare. No press conference or dramatic exit. Judge Whitmore was suspended, pending further review, and all of his scheduled cases reassigned. It was swift, sterile, and absolute. A quiet but absolute shift in the balance of power. Avery stood by her office window, looking out at the courthouse that had once seemed so imposing, now a symbol of something far different. It wasn't about the victory itself. It was about what had been broken open. What had been exposed. The weight of what had happened hadn't fully settled within her. She wasn't sure if she felt relief or something deeper, something more poignant. It wasn't about winning against Whitmore. It was about ensuring the truth was seen. Ensuring that the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked was now being held accountable. Her mother's sacrifices, the weight of the promises Avery had made to herself and to her, had led her here. And now, as Avery gazed out of the window, she realized that the real victory wasn't just the suspension of a corrupt judge. It was the shift in the air. The quiet revolution that had begun. It wasn't just about one man. It was about the power of truth and integrity in a system that had long overlooked both. Avery had done what she set out to do. She had exposed the truth. And now, no one could ignore it. What was once hidden was now visible for all to see. And that was a victory far greater than any courtroom judgment.